We just watched episode 6 of season 2 of X-Men 97 called Danger.exe. And listen, this episode is fine. There are quite a few moments and ideas in this episode that I find interesting, but I don't believe the episode really does anything interesting with them. That is to say, characters or ideas are introduced, especially characters and ideas that are from the comics and are clearly influenced by the comics. But not only do we get like a condensed version of that story, because that's what I'm used to in X-Men 97, but in almost every instance this week, they take the most interesting part out of the story. So we're left with, an action episode that introduces you to Lorna, invents danger, creates X-Corp. But I think when we get into how this works in the comics, you'll understand why this episode was kind of a letdown for me, especially because of how much I liked last week's episode. And I know it may sound like hypocritical because last week's episode also changed a lot of things from the comics, but I enjoyed it. The big difference was I just found it more entertaining than this week's episode. I think if you change things from the comics to make them more interesting or more fun, that's great. If you change things from the comics to make them less interesting, that's going to lose me. Also, my cat Mortimer very much on my lap right now, and that is because this week is, at least this season, the first episode where there is just a cat in Val Cooper's office that Polaris pets, which is interesting because it reminds me of a time Polaris pet a cat in the comics, and it did not go as well, but we don't have to get into that. But alright, so we're going to spoil everything in the episode. We got 3 episodes left, 7, 8, and 9. I'm not going to spoil them, although I will talk about the ending of this episode and very generally how that connects to the future of the show. And to be fair, there were a lot of things I liked about the episode. We'll get into all of those too. But I feel like we're going to end up talking mostly about the things that I found strange about this episode. And that is to say, this is my least favorite episode of a show where I really, really like every other episode, including the 3 we haven't seen, especially next week. I think episode 7 might be my favorite one of the season. So, it's the least good episode. It's like how the sheep talisman is kind of thought of as the most useless of the original talismans. But, it's the power of astral projection. That's still quite useful in certain circumstances. It just isn't as cool as super strength or heat vision or whatever the rat talisman did. I looked it up. The rat talisman is motion to the motionless, the power to bring things to life, which honestly may be the most interesting of the talismans. But yeah, I remember there were fights where a character would have the sheep talisman and they'd be like, I wanted a cool one. And it's still pretty cool. That's what this episode is for me. This is the sheep talisman episode. So for everyone who's upset that we didn't do it last episode 6 starts with the resolution to episode 4, which is everybody is back in the present except for Magneto, and Xavier is reliving the moment of Magneto's death. Originally it seems like a flashback, but it turns out it is a danger room simulation, which is an interesting idea, especially because the danger room treats this like a training exercise when the professor says,
"This was intended to be a therapeutic exercise, not a training one."
And people might say, well, this is out of character because of how bad this therapy would be. This is exactly on brand for what kind of therapy Xavier would come up with. A real therapist would be like, you gotta work through your emotions, talk about them with someone. You have to understand that it's not your fault. But Xavier's therapy would be go into the danger room and keep reliving the trauma until you're done. Now, as you could gather by the title, this episode is about the danger room, and we get a sense in this scene that the danger room is being radicalized by the words of Apocalypse. Now, we've never really gotten into how the danger room works in this series. Definitely not in 97. We've seen what it can do, but we've never got into how it can do that. If this follows the way this works in the comics, the danger room was originally a training room for the X-Men. It was a big metal room with things like tentacles and spikes and flamethrowers that would act as hazards and teach the kids how to adapt to emergency situations. Over time, the danger room was modified specifically with Shi'ar technology that gave the danger room the ability to create hard light constructs. Oh, by the way, the Shi'ar are the alien race from episode 6 or 7 of last season. They're bird people, and they have a highly advanced space empire. But as far as we've known up till this point, the danger room is not like a sentient thing. It is a very advanced piece of technology, but one that was programmed by Xavier and does what they say. Now, in this episode, it is going to go rogue. And this is something that happens in the comics, starting in Astonishing X-Men number 8, which was written by, don't worry about it, with art by John Cassidy, Laura Martin, and Chris Eliopoulos. This storyline runs through Astonishing X-Men number 12, and features many of the same beats as the episode, but we'll get into why they're different. The main one here is Apocalypse is not part of this story, so he is not why the danger room goes rogue. But then, very fun, we get the return of X-Factor. Here it's mostly Polaris, where we find characters I was not expecting. And when I saw the robes originally, I was like, oh, are those purifiers? Have we ever done that on this show? And specifically, the main purifier is the character who was Executioner in Season 1, Episode 2 of 97. Then the purifiers thing is confirmed when they bring up a hologram of Reverend William Stryker, who also was never in the original series. I think that's really interesting, because like we hear in this episode, former Senator, now President, Kelly, is the president, and he has made laws outlawing mutant activities, specifically the X-Men. You'd have to assume he also created X-Factor, although they have been around for a while in this series, so it's unclear who did that. But you've got him, and also in this series, we've had Graydon Creed before, a character who was mentioned last week. And he created the Friends of Humanity, another mutant hate group. So it's interesting that we're setting up a new anti-mutant public figure when two already exist in this universe. So one line that I found very interesting here, when Executioner takes the weapons out and calls Reverend Stryker, he says,
"Time to rain fire and vibranium down on the abominations."
Which would suggest that these guns are made out of vibranium, a very powerful fictional metal in the Marvel Comics universe. Firstly, where did you get that? But whatever. Second, I think it's interesting because it is sometimes one of the metals that Magneto can't control, which would explain why Lorna, who has the same power set as Magneto, also can't just take all of the weapons out of their hands. I imagine that's what that line is for. But Lorna shows up. One of the things I do really like about this episode, and was not really true about episode 2, is that the episode does a bunch of cool things with animating Lorna specifically, and how her powers work. First of all, we see the Aurora Borealis effect behind her, which I love. Second, I think they really get into how she can fight creatively. And we'll see in this scene, the other interesting thing about her, she's just very powerful. Powerful enough to pick up the boat, split it in half, and toss it at these guys. And I think this is another moment in the episode where the animators really kick it up a notch. Respect it. But X-Factor doesn't like radical Polaris, and she gets fired by Val Cooper, who, again, is a good person because she has a cat. Office dogs were a thing for a while. I feel like office cats makes way more sense. They're cleaner, you don't have to walk them. They get bugs and rats.
On board ship, we kept cats.
So just another reason Val Cooper, a strategic genius. Cute detail I kind of liked in Val's office, just to show off how powerful she is. Lorna is making the Newton's Cradle on Val's desk move, much like Magneto in the first X-Men movie, except Magneto's makes a little more sense because it's powered by Magneto. It's like the showing off he's doing is, look, I don't even need the rest of the cradle, I can just make these go. Whereas here with Lorna, it's like, yeah, the Newton's Cradle does that on its own. You don't need to use your powers to do that. What are you even doing with your powers there, besides stopping it? But she fires Lorna. And then we get a moment in the all-gender X-Factor locker room, which I imagine is maybe a reference to Starship Troopers, how X-Factor is also kind of the baddies. We see Rain here, we also see Alex. No Multiple Man and no Guido in this room, probably because a shirtless Guido would make it so the other characters can't concentrate on anything else because of how incredible he is. But anyway, Lorna's fired and we find out that there is a new place for mutants to go. And it is the same old place. It is the Xavier Mansion, which has been fixed for like the millionth time. I reread the Astonishing X-Men comics in preparation for this episode, and it reminded me of a great line Wolverine has, where he's talking about how many times the X-Mansion gets destroyed, and he just says, next time we rebuild it, we'll just use Legos. And now there is a Lego X-Mansion set, so Wolverine, you got your wish. It's expensive, but if Lego wants to send me one, I'll take it. But we find out that Xavier's Institute for Higher Learning is back in action. Xavier's giving a speech about Magneto's legacy, which I would think is like a little weird. Because sure, he's nice, but nobody saw that. All anybody knows about the last thing Magneto did is when he turned off all the electricity on Earth, which I'm sure affected these mutants negatively. But whatever, because we see all of the mutants here that are the new class. And it is largely mutants we've already seen, most in episode 2, although there are a few inclusions that are pretty interesting. I don't remember seeing Shark Girl before. I also don't remember seeing No Girl. I think Eye-Boy was in the prison, but he was a little hard to make out. Then there's another one who we'll get to. Then on the other side of the room, you have Rockslide, who seems to be wearing a pink shirt, which is a nod to the fact that he was one of the Hellions. In the comic run where he was introduced, that was the one that was trained by Emma, named after her first team of mutants who died tragically. Having a hard time placing the character next to Rockslide, just because I would say their design is somewhat generic. If you know who that is, throw it in the comments, let me know on Twitter. Apparently this girl, and I thought this was interesting, is a character known by fans as Parrot Girl. Mostly because she can transform into a parrot. But what's her name in the comics? We don't know. This character doesn't seem to exist in the comics. Her first appearance was in episode 5 of season 1 of X-Men 97, which is unusual. For some reason online, fans have named her Carmen Cruz, which is weird because that's the name of another character called Gimmick, who, yes, can shapeshift, but doesn't have that iconic hairstyle, so I put it in. And then you have Glob Herman and Wing. Then the one that I'm the most interested in, we get a close-up shot of that character from episode 2 who I also couldn't place. And looking at him now, and I got a lot of great comments from all of you about who you thought this was, well, the ones that convinced me had two arguments that this was Skin. The first one, which doesn't really work here but made sense in episode 2, is that if his mutant inhibitor collar was on, his face would go back to normal. However, that doesn't really explain why some of the other kids with physical powers didn't change more. And B, here he doesn't have his mutant inhibitor collar on, and he still looks like that. But then the second thing I heard from you guys that really made sense, in the original Generation X comics, Skin does not look like that. He has a little nose, big face, his features are very pronounced. However, when Terry Dodson took over in the Generation X comic, they sort of changed how Skin looked and made him a little bit more conventionally handsome. And this isn't too far from what his face looks like then. And Angelo does frequently wear shirts that are that color when he's off duty. So just the presence of almost all of the Generation X characters between episodes 2 and now 6 does make it seem like this is probably Skin. Now let's talk about the all-powerful, multi-dimensional elephant in the room, Dupe. There's a good chance you've seen Dupe before. He's a very fun X-Men mascot character. He's the X-Men's Baby Yoda. Just kidding. I guess that would be the Bamfs, which were little Nightcrawlers for a while, or Lockheed the Dragon. But Dupe was this guy who showed up, and no one could quite figure out what his deal was. To this day, we don't fully know what Dupe is. According to the wiki, there are rumors that he was a Cold War experiment. However, it also seems like he maybe comes from another dimension. He has all sorts of powers. He speaks a different language called Dupese, which a lot of the times the characters can just understand, and you can translate it if you want to, because he speaks it in the books. But Dupe is essentially if you took Mr. Mixie Spitlicks and put him in a Slimer body. He's incredibly strong, he's beaten Thor. Is he a mutant? Maybe. I don't know. Whether he is or is not a mutant depends on what the rest of his species is like. And as far as I know, we have not met other dupes. Also, this is D-O-O-P, unlike the term dupe, D-U-P, which is what Multiple Man calls his duplicates. I will say, A, I love to see Dupe here, because Dupe is part of the X-Statix run, which is another one of my favorite X-Men runs. My one issue, and I think they can easily write their way out of it, Dupe is not a kid. As far as we know, the way he's usually treated is like he's a staff member. In the X-Statix comics, he's their camera operator. I think it could be really funny if they ever do this in the future. If next time we check on Dupe, he's a teacher, or the janitor, or some other more official position, and someone like Jubilee, who's not spending a whole lot of time at the Institute these days, could ask, say, Morph, like, hey, why is that green kid teaching algebra? And Morph could say, well, it's a funny story. Dupe showed up at the Institute with all the kids, and no one spoke his language, so y'all just assumed he was one of the kids. Eventually, we figured out what he was saying, and it turns out he's older than Wolverine. And in his dimension, he's a teacher, so he put him on staff. And then that's the explanation for Dupe. And then Xavier does something very clever and original, where he programs the Danger Room to simulate a Sentinel attack to scare the kids. Now, this happens in the original Astonishing X-Men comic. However, this is something Emma does. And this is a good example of when this episode uses the aesthetics of the comic, but seems to miss the substance. In the moment in the show, Xavier's basically saying, there will be threats everywhere, so you need to be ready at all times. Which is true, and I would say is always true of the Institute, but that's kind of it. That's the only reason the professor chose to do this. Whereas in the comics, this is something Emma does, and it is specifically something new she does. Something none of the teachers have done before, and she explains it like this. So after Emma gives her intro speech, the Sentinels attack, the kids are scared, it's revealed to be a Danger Room thing, and Emma says, so, what have we learned? We have learned the first lesson. They will always hate us. We will never live in a world of peace, which is why control and nonviolence are essential. We must prove ourselves a peaceful people. We must give the ordinary humans respect, compliance, and understanding, and we must never mistake that for trust. And then what we also learn is Emma used that moment to scan the kids to see which ones of them wanted to get into a fight, so she could use that information later. Again, it's not that it doesn't work here, because it more or less does, but it is so much more interesting in the comics. Also, Professor, the way he justifies this is,
Danger lurks everywhere. You must be pushed, tested, to ensure your strength.
and it's like, Professor X, we just rescued these kids from super jail, except for Dupe, who's somewhere else. But I think more than pretty much any other freshman class at the Institute, they know. And we learned that Storm is going to be the headmistress here, which I like. I like giving Storm more responsibility. And I think she's got the right mix of experience, toughness, but also she's very kind and very comforting when she needs to be. And we'll find out that the other 3 members of the staff here at the Institute are Forge, Wolverine, and Morph. even though the rest of the X-Men are sitting up there on the platform with Xavier. We'll talk about why the rest of this group is very stupid later. So then Polaris comes home. And listen, I like Polaris enough. I do think she really feels retconned here, even though, yes, I know she was one of the first students at the Institute in the comics and in the series. As we see in the episode, Polaris shows up in X-Men the Animated Series. But still, these intros paint her in an interesting way. First, we see a picture with Polaris in her original costume and the first class of mutants, and a picture specifically with her and Bobby, because Polaris and Bobby were a couple. Now, according to I don't even know where, a news report in Universe, apparently Bobby is one of the mutants that died on Genosha. You wouldn't know that from how everybody acts in this episode. Not that you wouldn't know he's not there, but considering this is Polaris' first meeting with Jean, Scott, Beast, and eventually the Professor, I don't know, you figure how someone would bring up that it's sad how her ex died. I'm okay with them not mentioning Angel, because Angel's out there, and the circumstances of what Angel's doing are very complicated. I mean, Polaris fought Angel in her episode and it didn't come up. But still, it's the first instance of the show not necessarily retconning their relationships, but it seems like just simplifying a lot of them. And then Jean says,
"The professor insisted we not change a thing."
And I, and a lot of people on the internet have said, from when? The X-Mansion constantly explodes. Did you take pictures of her room and then print out duplicates of everything and put everything where it was every time the mansion got destroyed on the off chance that Polaris would show up that time? And I think the answer has to be yes. Also love that Beast is wearing a Howard the Duck t-shirt, and we learned a couple things about Polaris. Scott mentions that she was the teacher's pet, which is interesting because I always assume Scott is the teacher's pet, which would be fun. However, that attitude would kind of make sense, because Scott, the real teacher's pet, would be jealous of another perceived teacher's pet. Weird thing to call her the teacher's pet when we find out Xavier actually adopted her, though. And then to show that she's friends with Beast, Polaris names the person Beast was quoting before Beast does. And then we get a great conversation between Xavier and Lorna, where they lay out the emotional issues for the episode, which is that Lorna doesn't want to think about her relationship with Magneto, and Xavier can't stop thinking about his relationship with Magneto. Now, this idea is going to be important throughout the episode. My one thing is, if this was the first time anything like this had come up in X-Men 97, I'd say, okay, sure. Maybe that was some ground they covered in the original series, but what are they going to do? They can't rewrite what happened in the original series, so they're kind of working with that. But I think it's very strange that it's clearly something the writers thought about here, and at no point in any of the Magneto episodes from this season does Magneto mention possibly feeling bad about abandoning Lorna with Charles. Or does Charles tell Magneto that he has a daughter in the present who needs him? And they do it the one bit where they show Polaris in shadow on the boat in Xavier and Magneto's memory thing. But it feels so strange in this season of the show that there are things that it would seem like characters knew but never mention. And yes, I know people can have conversations with subtext, but I feel like there's not even subtext around Magneto this season where he's thinking about Polaris. I also think it's very strange that now that Polaris is on a team with Scott, they're not going to talk about the Havoc thing. I genuinely cannot figure out in this universe what these guys think is happening. Because in the X-Men animated series, it was clear that they knew something was weird about them, because their powers didn't work on each other, which is something we might have to get into later. But I would expect at some moment, Polaris would maybe pull Xavier aside and say, hey, should we tell Scott about Alex? Or something? Because it's not just unclear whether the characters know this, it's unclear whether the show knows this. Whether this is even true in the universe of the show, or in this version of the show, it's just a coincidence that their powers don't work on each other. They're actually not brothers. I couldn't tell you. I get the same thing with Bobby. Like, sure, there's a picture of them together, but like if Bobby died on Genosha, and when Polaris is forced to go to Genosha, is she not going to have a feeling about that specifically? And I get it, Bobby was her ex, but still, like, you would have an emotional connection. So it's strange how it feels like this episode specifically ignores bits of the canon that would otherwise be very important and would be what I would find interesting about this episode, about this reunion. But it feels like it comes out of nowhere because as far as this season is concerned, the Polaris-Magneto relationship does, even though we've had plenty of time with Polaris and Magneto where a character could mention this to them before today. Also, I do think the reads on these lines between these two characters are great. As I've said, I've loved Ross Marquardt through the series, but this is the most time we've gotten so far with Carolina Ravassa, and I like how uncomfortable and stubborn she feels. Also, very cute detail, Morph in the background playing jump rope with Mr. Fantastic arms. However, time for even more nitpicking. One thing I don't love about this episode, and feels like a real missed opportunity, is I don't think we spend nearly enough time with the students using their powers. Now, maybe there's a rule that they're not supposed to. I would say the way that rule usually works is they're not supposed to use their powers to fight, but something like this is something Skin could totally do. And I would love to see that at the school, because that's usually how the Xavier Institute works. The kids use their powers because they're not ashamed of them, especially the ones that aren't dangerous. However, there will be a far more egregious example of a moment where the kids aren't using their powers. We'll get to it in a second. And then Polaris meets Storm and Forge. I like that Forge mentions,
Miss me so much you got yourself booted off the team, eh?
because he and Polaris have a history. Forge and Polaris were originally on X Factor together. We've seen that in the picture in season 1. So I like the idea that these two have history. And then we find out that something happened to Wing. However, in the comics, Wing dies. In this, they're able to save him, which I think makes sense because it's a cartoon for kids. One detail I thought was interesting, in the moment, Sync says,
"Come on, Wing. I'm not losing another friend."
Which is a reference to how, in the comics, a young character died around Sync, but in the comics is a character we have not seen called Blink. You may remember Blink from X-Men Days of Future Past. She's a mutant who is able to teleport, and she does die in the comics. The Blink you're familiar with, because you've definitely seen this character before, is the Blink from the Age of Apocalypse storyline. But I like that they referenced that here. It was interesting. Honestly, I couldn't remember what it was, and I googled it. I was like, oh, that's cool. And then they do a version of that thing that doesn't work like this in real life, but does on TV shows. And I love this moment of Storm charging up Bishop. I think it's cool. This is a cool thing. I don't really have more to say about it than that. But then there's an intruder at the front gate, so everybody has to go to the front gate, and Storm says,
Bishop, stay and monitor the boy.
Help, Bishop. He does not know what it is like to be a student here.
Storm, do any of you? And this is one of my problems with the Institute team. Besides Polaris, did anyone here grow up as a student at the Institute? Wolverine certainly didn't. I don't think Forge did, because he seems to be older than Cyclops, and he wasn't there when Cyclops was there. We see Storm's origin in the original series. I'm not sure how old she's supposed to be, but I think she's on the older side. And then maybe Morph was a student here. This is one of the things I find so strange about who works in the Mansion and who works at X-Corp. None of the original first class of X-Men, Cyclops, Jean, and Beast, are staying behind to teach at the Institute. And I find that strange. Like, I get it, Forge. She's your girlfriend. But maybe you guys can separate a little bit. Maybe that would be healthy for you at this point. First, you almost got yourself killed by time traveling to where Bishop surely should have been time traveling, because you wanted to see your girlfriend. And now you're teaching at this school, even though it doesn't seem like you've been here either. Also, Forge, what are you going to teach? I get that you're a scientist, kind of, but you don't usually know how your machines work. You don't invent things. Your power is that you can make a machine that does anything, you just specifically do not know how it works. What are you going to teach everybody? Magic? Maybe. I don't know. Just feels like a strange choice. And then Bishop's very mean to the kids. I'm with Polaris. Bishop, you're giving him a little too much grief, especially since no one has asked whether the kids did this or not. Bishop just sort of assumes they did. And then we see what might be the only time one of the students uses their powers. And I love this detail. Polaris picks up this stretcher with Wing on it, using her magnetism. But then when she has to go examine the door, she leaves the stretcher, and Sync, who is able to copy mutant powers of the people within his vicinity, usually, although I think eventually that gets changed to just like people he's seen recently. But then he starts holding the stretcher, and he does it with a mutant power signature that is similar to Polaris's, but has his own rainbow color scheme. That's perfect. Let's talk about the 4 conscious kids in the room. So this is Chamber, Sync, and Monet. 3 characters from Generation X, which seems like out of all the groups of X kids, this is the writer's favorite, because this season obviously also has Jubilee, but we've seen Skin and Mondo. The only original member of this team I can't place is Husk. And like, she's a blonde white girl, so she could have been in the background on one of these shots and I missed her. She doesn't have a particularly interesting look until she rips her skin off. But she's Cannonball's sister, so maybe we saw her in the Cannonball episode. Maybe they canonically made her kind of too young to have been here. I don't remember. But then the Danger Room starts fighting everybody. Polaris and Bishop protect the kids. This is another example. I love Polaris's power signature here. How it's not just circles radiating or a dome. It is a good visualization of what a magnetic field looks like. And then Bishop uses his mutant power to absorb the energy blasts and take out the guns. Now, usually I would say, Polaris, why aren't you doing this? Aren't they metal? But I imagine for this episode to work, Danger needs to have some way to anti-magnetize herself and the Danger Room so that Polaris can't just pick her up and throw her into space. So I'm sort of accepting that that covers the guns and any constructs in the Danger Room, even though that won't necessarily be the case later. But then Polaris and Bishop fight a bunch of robots that Polaris can apparently control. So I don't know what's stopping Polaris later from just pulling Danger's head off, but whatever. Love this little spin move. It's the kind of thing you expect to see in like Marvel Rivals, and it kind of makes me want to see Polaris in Marvel Rivals, because now I can see a version of her that doesn't just feel like Magneto, one that's more of a brawler. But then the Danger Room creates Bishop's future, which I always pictured as just like a hellscape. So we get a Matrix future rave, that's fun, and Prime Sentinels come out and start attacking the kids. Now for this I'm thinking, oh, this is an excellent way to introduce Polaris, because we get to do the Polaris origin via her Cerebrotech-influenced Danger Room training exercise. However, they don't do that. So then Polaris and Bishop fight the Prime Sentinels. Now, if I get to pick one big gripe with this episode, it would be this. There we have 4 students there. Sync, the chamber, sometimes is a little rebellious, but otherwise has one of those powers that you don't always want to use because it's dangerous. There is no way you could stop Monet St. Croix and Quentin Quire from also getting involved in this fight. And in my head, that's the fun of this kind of episode. Quentin Quire is the world's biggest show-off, and Monet thinks she's better than everybody, because she is. But I would love to see some of these kids use their powers, and they could maybe even make things worse because they're not as well trained, which could make Lorna even more scared of using her powers because she set a bad example. But I think it's weird that we have seen so much of these kids, and so far, they've been in 2 big fight scenes, this and the Jubilee one, and we haven't had one moment where all the kids join in and fight. I mean, on one hand, I would have that just be this episode. Like, all of the kids versus the Danger Room. This would be a great way to introduce these 4 kids, have the Danger Room create their backstories. But I get it, it's a Polaris episode, so we're not doing that. But at least let the kids fight. If for no other reason than showing Quentin using his powers would kind of justify why he's being such a jerk here, is because he does have big, showy powers, but maybe that would humble him a little bit because he's not perfect at using them. And then giving Quentin this connection to Polaris could be interesting, especially because he's wearing the Magneto was right shirt and she's Magneto's daughter. How does that not come up? Then Danger creates her body and fights Polaris and Bishop, and I guess not the kids, because then she leaves. Now, in this moment where Polaris wakes up and sees Storm, in my head, I'm thinking, oh, this is a hologram. Because one of the things Danger's really good at, and one of the things that's really fun about Danger, although it does get a little overused in her X Factor book, is the idea that Danger can not only just grow things she needs for fights, she can also project hard light constructs. And she does this a lot of time to trick people into doing things. You know, she'll create a distraction by making it seem like the team is off doing something when in reality they're sneaking in through a different door. That's a classic Danger move. I'm fine with her not doing that here. That was just a first example of oh, which one of these guys is going to morph into Magneto first or something, especially since Lorna seemed to be unconscious. So then we find out Danger is flying to Genosha, and she is going to get the professor. And Forge tells Storm,
Tracker says it's heading to Genosha.
We must get to the professor.
We can't, darling. Kelly's executive order. We get involved, we endanger the school's charter.
Okay, but maybe this thing's going to kill him. Also, why is Bishop allowed to go? I get that maybe he isn't technically staff at the Xavier Institute, but for a while, him and Forge were the only 2 people there. But it's okay, because apparently Bishop and Lorna can go. Now, I kinda like this relationship. I like how casual it is, I enjoy their back and forth, and I like how they complement each other. She's the teacher's pet, she's very powerful, he plays by his own rules, she also plays by her own rules. But he was raised by the streets, and she was raised by the Institute, and as we'll see later, he can absorb her excess power. So it turns out the professor went with Beast, Scott, and Jean to Genosha. Now, the first time we see these characters, they are wearing their Frank Whiteley era X-Men costumes. I cannot explain why. In the comics, this represents a big change in the status quo, and I would be fine with that because of what happens at the end of the episode. It just seems weird to me that they've done this now, as opposed to, like Xavier and Polaris and Bishop will be doing, just wearing casual clothes. Also, I'm not convinced the Quietly outfits translate as well to animation as they do in the comics or even live action. Not that I think the live action ones were great, but I think they're missing a little bit of texture. Kind of looks like they're all wearing big yellow marshmallows. So again, it's another example of the aesthetics of the comics, but without the deeper meaning. Then they're alerted that danger is coming. And it turns out it's the Danger Room and has the same electromagnetic signature as the Danger Room. It also has the same voice as the Danger Room, although they haven't heard that yet. But also, it has the same voice as Chip and Cable's Time Slider. I think that's a really interesting decision, even though it doesn't seem incredibly deliberate, because that's never something that's brought up. It seems like the Danger Room has been like that for a while. The Danger shows up, and Cyclops shoots optic blasts, and Jean throws rocks at her, but it doesn't work. Probably wouldn't work with most villains, but it's definitely not going to work with the one who knows you shoot optic blasts. But then they get creative. And then Jean makes Wolverine claws that reflect Scott's optic blast, and they do hit Danger, but then Danger makes her disco ball with her hand, and it reflects the optic blast back at Scott. But like we said, Scott is not affected by his own optic blast. That's why he's not affected by Alex's optic blast. Oh wait, never mind, he is now. Then Beast updates Danger's software so that she doesn't know what the professor is going to do, and just for old time's sake, tries to attack her before getting blasted away. Fun note in the book, the way Beast attacks Danger in the book is this was one of the first instances where Beast goes, well, I need to do something you're not going to anticipate. I'm just going to go full Beast, like feral Beast, especially because at that moment, Danger has the wings they'll have later in the episode. And I love Beast's line there of, you've got your scenarios running, I'm sure. Very complex, mine's simple. I'm a cat, you're a bird. And Beast just dives at Danger. But instead, they do something just as cool here. He gets blasted and then he's out for the rest of the fight. But then Danger meets the professor, and we find out specifically why Danger is so obsessed with the professor. And it's because Danger saw what happened to Magneto and decided the only way to teach Xavier the lesson would be to kill him on Genosha? Which, listen, in the comics, it's much more interesting. I understand why they didn't have time for this one. It just, again, feels a little weird to me because they did all the same things, but without the motivation that in the comics, the professor upgraded the Danger Room with Shi'ar technology. That's why it can do hard light constructs. But what the professor knew that nobody else did was that the Danger Room was sentient, and the professor made it do Danger Room stuff anyway, which Xavier does because he believes training his X-Men is so important, but he essentially enslaved some form of intelligent life. And that's why Danger hates him so much. When I heard Danger's voice, I kind of thought, oh, that's why Danger's acting so weird right now. And maybe that can be something we reveal in the future. I don't know. I don't think it's worth it at this point. But that's why it's interesting in the comics. Because they had a motivation, they had a beef with Xavier, but they were also like their own character. Whereas this version of Danger just doesn't feel as interesting. And I would be surprised if we see her again. But then right as Danger's about to cut Xavier's head off with an axe, Polaris takes the axe away from Danger so Professor is safe. And then throws the axe back at Danger, and I'm like, that's a little too close to the Professor, Polaris. But it works, Danger's knocked away, and instead of just using her magnetism to immobilize Danger, she uses her magnetism to control wires that immobilize Danger. At this point, I'm like, Danger's mad all right, but whatever, it wouldn't be interesting if she could just do that. And Polaris says,
didn't factor me into your equation.
And I'm like, I'm pretty sure she did, because A, she met you earlier today, and B, it seems like Danger scrambled the communications between Polaris and Charles, so she would have known Polaris was coming. But then Polaris says,
think it's about time for a hard reboot. Stand down.
And Danger replies,
I'm just a product of what I am molded from, as are you, destined to repeat the sins of the ones who made us.
And I'm like, wait a second, are we doing the thing where she's Shi'ar technology? Or maybe Apocalypse technology or something? But don't worry about it. But then Jean does big psychic tornado, and Polaris throws beams at Danger, and that kills Danger. But then it turns out Danger's absorbing the power, so we need to overpower Danger all at once, otherwise Danger's gonna kill everybody, and they decide to use Polaris. And Xavier and Polaris have a little mind meld where they remember Magneto, and Polaris uses all of her power to explode Danger, and Danger falls to the earth, and everyone goes, alright, well, I guess we're done with Danger, even though Danger just rebuilt herself like 2 minutes ago. Also, cute detail, I love that Polaris has the skull on her wristband, which is a reference to a piece of her original costume. She's one of the surprisingly more than one X-Men characters that just has a skull on their outfit for some reason. The other big one is Mystique. And then the fight is over. Which, one last complaint about how this is not like the comics. In the comics, this fight continues because Danger uses her power to resurrect the Wild Sentinel and have that fight the X-Men. And this is another moment where Kitty does something cool that she's not going to be able to do in the future, probably. I understand why they didn't do that here. A, it just seemed to fully explode. I guess it was like atomized by Gambit, although Gambit's body survived, so why wouldn't the Wild Sentinel? And now that I think about it, it would have been kind of cool to see Lorna kill the thing that almost killed Magneto. But then Xavier reveals his new idea that he just got now. He wants to create X-Corp, some sort of global organization that would fall outside of the jurisdiction of the American president. I guess. I mean, it probably wouldn't if they want to do things in America. But still, that's what the explanation is here. In the comics, X-Corp is a globalization where there are many offices because the X-Men need to expand. There needs to be more of them. And if this was the first time we saw the Quietly outfits, I'd think that was perfect. I would say, oh, these are official outfits for a new thing, something that is distinct from their old X-Men looks. I wish they weren't wearing them during the Danger fight, and I genuinely can't think of a good reason why they are, especially because they don't leave the Institute wearing them. They get changed over the course of the trip. I don't know. Love the new look for Xavier, especially since his chair was destroyed, so he has to create a new one, and this is what he wears during the Quietly era, and this is the posture he usually adapts during the Quietly era because of how this chair works. I like that adaptation here. And we see 6 of what will be the 8 members. The other 2, which were shown in some promo materials a while back, are Polaris and Bishop, but we have the Professor, Scott, Jean, Nightcrawler, Rogue, and Beast, which does remind you, oh right, Nightcrawler and Rogue exist. Where have they been this episode? Maybe in some Screen X version of this episode, you could see them over on the left and right of screen. I don't know. Also, I'm honestly kind of unironically excited about the Screen X version of Spider-Man, because it seems like they just really went all in on that, and I don't know, maybe it'll be cool. So now that we've got our X-Corp team and our Institute team, let's talk about why these teams are terrible. There are a couple people who I understand being where they are. Storm is a good headmistress. Rogue is probably best kept away from the students. Professor needs to be in charge here. So far, I think this makes sense. But then, why is Forge, again, the person who does not know how his machines work, a teacher, instead of the much more obvious Beast, who, besides being a super genius, is also obsessed with the classics and art, history? There are so many things Beast could teach. Also, Beast is very friendly. Also, one of the great things about Beast as a teacher is he looks weird. Sure, Morph looks weird, but Morph is a character who can change their appearance whenever they want. I think it is crucial for one of the teachers at the X-Men team to be a mutant who cannot hide their appearance so the other kids can relate to. This is usually something in the books. You could also use Nightcrawler for this, especially as Nightcrawler is traditionally one of the most agreeable X-Men, one of the most compassionate members of the team. People love him. It would make nothing but sense to have him at the Institute. And then Jean and Scott, 2 founding members of the X-Men. The 2 people out of everyone here with the most X-Men experience outside of Beast, one of them should be at the Institute. Jean Grey should clearly be at the Institute. Scott should be here. Or vice versa, but it feels like Jean is better positioned to be a teacher, and Scott is better positioned to be the face of the company, right? Because you want someone with experience. It also is nice to have a telepath at the school so they can figure out what the kids are thinking. That's something that it's cool that Emma does, even though it's kind of an invasion of privacy. And then have Polaris stay at the school. If for no other reason, then she still needs to learn some stuff about herself. And then on the other team, I like having Wolverine as a teacher. It's fun to have Wolverine be at the Institute because he is so tough. I like Morph being a teacher. I think they can do fun things. Also, they just don't seem like they'd want to be wrapped up in all the boardroom stuff. But like Forge and Beast should obviously switch places. And then we get the end of the episode tease in Athens. And we see in the background the Watcher, which means something important's going to happen, which is traditionally true of post-credit scenes. And we see that underneath the Parthenon, Apocalypse has a secret lab because that's kind of how he works. He had one under Stonehenge. He likes making labs under the landmarks that would be in the It's a Small World After All ride. And then a guy, who knows who it could be, is on the table. And Apocalypse says,
"Let us begin."
To who? Who is Apocalypse speaking to? In this moment, maybe it's because Apocalypse knows this is important. Hey, maybe he's even talking to the Watcher because he's like, it's about to start, get ready. But Apocalypse turns up the whatever this is, starts bringing the mysterious man, who could it be, back to life. And here Apocalypse gets my favorite line of the episode, where he tells someone to
increase the power!
And then his henchman, the loyal Apocalypse, hears this and increases the power. This is where I understand why some people think there might be 2 Apocalypses in this room. I don't think that's what's happening here. But like, Apocalypse, who are you talking to? You could say, I need more power, but increase the power is a command. Then we see whoever this is overcome with pink energy, which could belong to any character, and they become surrounded by playing cards that turn into tarot cards. Again, there are a lot of characters this could be. This probably means this is the Hellion Tarot on this table. That's the only thing I can assume. And the 3 tarot cards we see are Death, the Tower, and the Lovers. Death, I assume, has something to do with death. The Lovers is clearly an image of Gambit and Rogue. And then the Tower is interesting. They just made a new tower, but also, as a fan of Agatha all along, I know that the tower represents bad things. According to Labyrinthos, the upright keywords are disaster, destruction, upheaval, trauma, sudden change, and chaos. However, if it's reversed, that's averting disaster, delaying the inevitable, resisting change. Man, Agatha all along was good. especially that episode. And then, wait a second, that's not Taro. That's Gambit, but like a death version of Gambit that people on the internet call Deathbit. And we see the way they're going to make that distinction here is he is a black and white version of Gambit, but still with glowing eyes, although this time they're red. So listen, I think this episode is fine. I have discussed what I like about it, what I don't like about it. I think it's an episode that if you're very familiar with the comics and you see some of these things in the trailer and you get excited because this is going to be Emma and Kitty's big moment, and Danger's going to resurrect the Prime Sentinel, and we're going to see the kids use their powers, and we're going to see why the team changes to the Quietly outfits, then, you know, I get it. I get why this is kind of a letdown. I also think as an episode of this season, it feels strange because it really focuses on Polaris. As if Polaris is going to be kind of the main character of the next couple episodes, and having seen the next couple episodes, and having seen this little pre-credit stinger, I don't think you'd be shocked at which X-Men character sort of takes center stage for the rest of the season. But hey, now we got a Polaris. The quota of one Magneto guy per episode has been filled, and like I said a couple of times, next episode is probably my favorite one of the season, so get excited for that. And listen, if you love the X-Men, like I do, you love superpowers, you love messy relationships, a lot of fantasy tropes, which reminds me of a video I was watching called Time to Pivot to Romantasy, I guess, by one of my favorite creators, Lindsay Ellis. In it, Lindsay talks about the romantasy genre, which I was fascinated by. I've been hearing about it for years, never really knew what it was. And I think Lindsay's perspective on it as an author who writes about something that's kind of similar is really interesting. I would say it's definitely worth a watch, whether you are a big fan of romantasy or, like me, someone who has heard about it a lot but doesn't really know what it is. And you can find that video along with tons of other videos on this video's sponsor, Nebula. Nebula is a subscription streaming platform that I and a bunch of other YouTubers you probably already love helped to create. First thing that's important, all of our videos go up there early and ad-free. So if you want to be the first person to see one of my Nando V movies or Nando Cut videos, Nebula is for you. And then there are series like Jetlag or Tom Scott's England, where they go up on Nebula a week before they go anywhere else. Then we also have Nebula exclusive series of videos, like Tom Nicholas has a series called Slow News Day. Captain Midnight has a series called Showrunners, where he looks at different people that have created television shows. The first episode is about Rod Serling in The Twilight Zone. The second episode is about Vince Gilligan in Breaking Bad. Looks at the journey of how they got to where they were and how that shaped the series they would showrun. And then Curious Archives Gods and Monsters series looks at these different legendary creatures from religion and mythology and talks about how the ideas of those creatures has evolved over time and they've turned into pop culture characters. So you can find all that great stuff exclusively on Nebula. And a year of Nebula is already a steal at $60 a year. That is $5 a month. But if you go to go.nebula.tv/thenandocut, you can get Nebula for just $2.50 a month. That is $30 for the year. It's an awesome deal. Go check it out. I guarantee there is a creator you already love who's part of Nebula. And if you spend some time on Nebula, I bet you'll find your new favorite creator. After me, of course. Your second favorite creator because I'm your favorite. Don't correct me. Again, that is go.nebula.tv/thenandocut. Excited to talk about next week and potentially other X-Men news from Comic-Con. Until then, stay safe. I'll see you around.